Welcome back to another book highlight. We are moving into book 3 of the series, My Father the King. And for this book highlight, I'd like to dive into something a little bit different because we're not only introducing a new book, but a new character. Mephibosheth is the son of Prince Jonathan in the Bible, and I nicknamed him Mephi to make things easier for the novels. But he's kind of an obscure character in scripture for many years. Now, there's a ton of political intrigue and lots of strong ribs to his story in the Bible, so it wasn't too hard to imagine and craft a compelling plot out of what is there. But there are many years where nothing is said about Mephi. So I wanted to do a more writer-intensive book highlight and share a little about what my process was like writing this book and creating Mephi's character, because the whole thing was so satisfying and rewarding, and there's actually a lot in it that relates to what we can learn from the book going forward. Now, you might say, why do you have to create the character? He's already in the Bible. Yes, but that can be a pitfall if you let the few verses in scripture do all the work. What happens then is that you end up with a very one-dimensional character who acts like a puppet on a string, just doing what everyone expects him to do. These people were real humans, and they acted like real humans. So I had to get in touch with that side of Mephi and understand it if I was going to produce a whole novel about him. It's not just about narrating what happens. So writing the other two novels, I had known this third one was coming, and I actually had some notes from years ago when I'd considered writing a single book about Mephi. So I collected those, and some of the character names actually fit with what I had already set up in the other two novels. So that was such a God thing. And splitting my original idea into a 3-part series was so fun because it allowed me to go back and sort of set things up a little bit better for book 3 and make sure everything connected, and basically like a mystery novel working backwards and scattering connections so it makes sense but seems random. It's so exciting, but I knew that I would have to do some more research. So this was my process for book 3. I took the notes I already had from years ago and I took inventory and then added my new process that I'd used for the other two novels. So basically I write and dramatize the parts of the story that stand out to me or inspire me, even if they're at the end or in the middle of the story. I write the parts that I want to write first, the climactic parts that I was excited about. And I put it all together and started reading and rereading the entire section of scripture and making lists of what I already had and what I would need. And from that point, I have to introduce structure to the loose ends that I have. So for this story, I knew I needed a strong character arc because Jonathan and David are very strong, well-known characters, but a lot of that is already set up in scripture. And so I wanted Mephi to be just as well-rounded and relatable. Like I said, I took the themes I saw in scripture and worked on developing him as a character around that. It's more important to make them interesting than likable. One of my favorite examples of this is Katniss Everdeen in The Hunger Games. She's not a super likable person. She's not warm and fuzzy. She's not nice in the beginning, but she's immediately relatable because we are invited into her world. And that becomes more important than us liking her, and we end up liking her anyway. So I looked at all the main points in Mephi's life, and I highlighted the power points, basically the main things that happened to him, and made a rough timeline of his life, what I would need to include from scripture. And in light of that, I looked at what I could learn from Mephi as a character. How would he have been affected or respond to everything that happened? I studied him and his particular trauma. I knew it would start with a prologue explaining how he broke his legs. And I knew that chapter 1 would begin with him a little older at age 13, begging, because that's what people did if they were disabled in that culture. But what chapter 1 sets up is Mephi's desire as a person. And this started to take shape after I noticed a 3-part pattern to Mephi's character arc. And now a character arc is basically what the character learns and how they change, where they end up in the story. You can't just have them interacting with outside forces and think you can make it look cool enough to compensate for a lack of depth. Mephi goes through 3 distinct character shifts of maturity on his way to the end, and I will be highlighting those going forward. But I knew the main challenge would be making sure that Mephi wasn't just a victim of circumstance. Even if people see him that way, it makes sense that a real person, however traumatized, would still try to improve their life. They would still have hopes and dreams and fears. And that's where chapter 1 comes in. We see Mephi living in a bad situation, but it's safer than what he knew before. And so now he's starting to think and plan, and he really resents the way he's been raised and he's trying to improve his situation. Now, he's a bit naive about how to go about that, but he's desperate to make a life for himself and prove that he's able and worthy in spite of what he can't do. Now, this whole process was a lot of work, but it was an incredibly exciting and rewarding, satisfying journey, and the whole point is to share it. I love to share with people the deeper meaning, but there's so much structure and planning behind good stories, and so I wanted to share that this time. I would encourage you to comment with any questions you might have about choices I made with Mephi's character, but also go to other favorite stories and study those characters. Ask yourself why you think the writer made certain decisions and what makes you relate to the character the most. It really opens up your understanding as a reader and a processor of what you're reading, because you're not just a spectator or a consumer. Ideally, you're being invited into an adventure, and you should take something out of it that stays with you forever. Relatable characters and strong plot structure give you that.